It's time to rip the cover off what really works to ditch addiction, depression, anger, anxiety, and all other kinds of human suffering. No, not sobriety. We're talking the F word here, freedom. We'll share straight from the trenches what we've learned from leaving our own addictions behind and coaching hundreds of others to do the same. And since it's such a heavy topic, we might as well have a good time while we're at it. All right, welcome back, folks, to the Alive and Free podcast book club now, who moves on to adventure number 7, known as the Rorschach Condundrum. Those of you who don't know who Rorschach is, it's okay. Hermann Rorschach, he developed a personality test with ink blots, hence the cover of the book. There's an ink blot behind the guy. It is not a fart cloud.
Unless that's what you see.
Unless that's what you see, which he would be more than happy to accept as part of his... Nice one, Jasmine. Very, very nice. So, in this chapter, we kind of dive into, kind of this is where we go to ancient Greece. This is where I was looking particularly at. Where did everything kind of go off the rails? Right. And so from there, we take it. So those of you who have the book, obviously you've read all the stories about Plato and everything else. What sort of stood out to you in this dialogue, or what questions might you have, or things like that?
I just want to say that I had to live with Bob while he was writing this book, and Plato is like my new arch enemy because while Bob was going through this and studying this, it was, I don't know, months long where he was just ranting about Plato and everything that Plato brought and all this stuff. And it was some pretty deep stuff. So pay attention to what he says about Plato, because I had to live through all of that.
Do it for my wife, folks. Do it for my wife. And there are some great things that Plato definitely contributed to the Western tradition. At least there's millions of people that would argue for that. I'm not in a position to tell you whether they're great or not, but it has definitely fueled a lot of Western civilization. And there's some things that snuck in under the hood with all the other stuff that he sent along that I think there've been, Jeff, you've studied a lot of the philosophical side of things, and there's a lot of people that argue against him anyway, right? Sure. That look at the things that he's offered, and there's arguments against him. It's just that he kind of set the tone. Because his works survived, one, and were readable, two, he sort of set the tone for what the conversation was about. And when somebody makes the rules of the game, sometimes we forget that, what if those rules aren't the best rules? And so I think that's where this comes in. It's not that his opinions weren't helpful. It's just that they came from a certain worldview that people didn't, step outside of it for a second and go, wait a second, what if there's a totally different way to look at this? Until much later, after all of those ideas had taken root and become sort of a public or a common way of thinking. Is that fair enough to?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
I think I there's been several times I've just been surprised in the last couple of years, learning that, with Freud, he didn't really use any kind of scientific anything to say what he said. There was no testing equipment, that kind of thing. But with this chapter, we're talking about Plato, that he basically says, I believe what I believe because I believe it.
Yeah.
Right? And it's most convenient for me to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole idea of confirmation bias, which is the basis of so much of where we get our modern thought, is based on this guy's opinion and because he liked it.
Yeah.
It seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, it is. It's funny because it doesn't, you have to be, I don't know. I was reading it. I'm like, did he just say what I thought he said? Because he stuck it in Socrates' mouth first. So he doesn't actually get to be like, it's not me. My teacher said it, which we don't have any evidence that he did or didn't say it. It might be something that he said. It might not. But basically what we're reading with all the Platonic dialogues is not what Socrates said, but what Plato recorded of what Socrates said and how Plato made sense of what Socrates said or used it for his own purposes, which he was brilliant enough to do that sometimes too, and have Socrates say stupid things or not helpful things in order to get around to another point. And so in this case, this is Socrates' deathbed thing where he's getting, this is this grandiose scene. And he's going to drink the poison hemlock, and in the middle of it, they're having a philosophical conversation, because that's usually what happens on a person's deathbed. I remember when my grandpa died, I got a phone call. That's it. Not from my grandpa. It was after the fact. Nobody was having philosophical arguments, so this is fabricated as a scene, so to speak. Although, if Socrates was what he was, I don't imagine if he was lucid at all. And since it was a poisoning, I imagine that there could have been this kind of thing. So here he is. And in the middle of this dialogue, they're concerned about, I don't remember the exact topic in question, but he says, look, let's not like poo-poo. He had just been finished telling people how the senses are not reliable. And then they're like, oh, how can we trust anything then? And he's like, well, hold on. Let's back up. Let's not just like throw thought out the window whatsoever. Like it's our only thing that we can hold on to. And so what I do is I find the thing that makes the most sense, basically. And then anything that I see that agrees with it, I keep. And anything that I see that disagrees with it, I don't keep. Which sounds a lot like basically a religious tenet of sorts, but it's a philosophical standpoint. And I was reading that going like, did he just say what I think he just said? Did he just say like, no, I think this makes sense. So if you bring any evidence to the contrary, I don't buy it. I won't accept that in my court of opinion. And I was like, wait a second. That's not how science works. But empirical science kind of came from Aristotle, which was one of Plato's students, right? Somewhat in response to this or in reaction to this. But his opinion on all of these things was this, that like thought was supreme, that there's some invisible world out there that is the truth and everything else in here is distorted. And the only way to know the truth is through reason, rationale, logic. And to that, I go, well, yeah, but all of your thoughts are rooted in what? So here's where we go. The brain is not in contact with the outside world at all. It is only in contact with that outside world as far as we can tell, mediated through the lens of the body. So every individual body is giving each individual brain information. And depending on how that body reacts, the brain then has thoughts and feelings about it. And most of the people out there that are trying to teach people how to manage their emotions, often they're going like, well, you change your thought and then you'll change the feeling. But that's halfway down the train already. What I work with people on is how do we change the body's instinctive reaction to the environment so that the basic building blocks of thought are different. And then the thoughts just become different. So it is helpful to reframe thoughts, but I want to deframe thoughts, so to speak. And this was one where I'm like, yeah, but if Plato were walking down the road, he wouldn't just close his eyes, be like, well, my eyes are unreliable, so I'll just close them and I'll wander to the store via thought alone. This makes sense. It's more rational that I should walk 30 paces to the right and then straight on till the left star to the right till morning, straight on till morning or something. And he wouldn't do that. He would keep his eyes open. And so that's where I was like, wow, this right here feels like a turning point that somehow or other early on because most of Western thought was pretty much Christian oriented after like Constantine and whatnot. Like it subsumed Greek culture and took in all that influence, but it was like Christians that went forward that way. And so the idea of people denigrating the body as this negative thing, as this evil shell that we're on, or this corrupt thing, that started to happen later on in Christianity. Like Jesus wasn't about that at all. Like in his time, the body was the only place that God could manifest because there wasn't really an afterlife. It was this life, which is why resurrection was such a big thing. So Plato comes in and he's like, no, there's another world, and this world is the one we're trying to escape. And so like that idea that the body is negative, that's where I was like, holy cow, if we just take that down the line, then I see all these psychologists and all these people that are trying to resolve emotional struggles and mental struggles through thought alone, just like Plato and Socrates possibly and others would have, instead of going, well, and don't get me wrong, Plato was a wrestler. He was physically fit. Like in Greece, they did a lot of things like this.
Yeah, Plato was his nickname.
Yeah, Plato was he was Aristocles, or however you say that in actual Greek.
But I think Plato just means like buff.
It means broad shoulders. Yeah. It means broad shoulders, So if you have platonic love, you have broad-shouldered love.
Nice.
You can carry a lot. Some people need to have less Plato love. And so like he was active, physically active, and many schools of thought, you know more about this, Jeff, than I do in terms of the schools of thought, like the Epicureans and the others, like they were very into taking care of the body, and they weren't like just frivolous and whatnot. They took care of themselves quite well. And maybe by force, maybe society required it in some way, shape, or form. They had to do war. They had to do some time in the service and things like that. But Here it was an instance where even though he's taking care of his body, and it is some sense a source of pleasure, it for him was like, that's the problem. The body is the problem. The world is the problem. And that was Plato's take on it. And that sort of influenced the whole of psychology. Some people called Plato the first psychologist, actually. And, talking through problems this way. And that was where I feel like everything went south, was restricting the resolution of bodily stuff to the mind alone. When current science says 90% of the serotonin produced in your body is produced in your gut. Oh, Lee and I were talking about this today. Like, why is it that a portrait of a person is just from the shoulders up? Their Plato up. When the reality is their moods, even their personalities, can be altered by the microbiome of their gut. Maybe we ought to take pictures of people's bellies, and then we would know who they are much better than the fake faces they put on in church.
I'm trying to hide my belly.
We would definitely get a lot of comments about dad bod from my kids. But like, that's fascinating that what a person is restricted to what is above the shoulders, what is above the body. And that I felt was like the big turn in psychology. And so, I made the case for it in here. I'm sure there are other people that would argue differently, but that's that. There was another person, though, across the globe who thought differently. He was dealing with the same kind of problem. The world is off. There's something wrong with the world. And that's one I introduce as Sid in the book, but his name was Gautama Siddhartha, Sid for short, and he came to be known as the Buddha. And his issue was human suffering. Like, there's something wrong with the world. And then he goes off and he finds his own solution. And then a little bit later, someone comes to him and they want him to solve all the problems. And he tells them essentially, well, the problem that you have is that you think all of this is a problem in the first place, that you've already prejudged the whole situation and saying it shouldn't be functioning this way, which is where I raised the question of, like, so many of us are sitting here judging that the world is wrong, that there's something wrong with the world or something wrong with ourselves. And that very judgment is creating a problem in the cells, which we talk about in the next adventure with the human effect, right? But that very judgment is part of the issue. And so here he's saying, no, your issue is that you've decided that it's all bad in the first place. You get rid of that judgment. And Sadhguru, one time I heard him say, he said, if you really believed that everything that is happening to you is God's will for you, that it's for your benefit, then you would never be unhappy in your life. And then he looked around and he's like, obviously you don't believe that because you're sitting here miserable, And there was a slap in the face for me, to be honest, because it was also indicative of the kind of faith I lacked in a big way.
It's interesting, like Sid, comes from this very wealthy family and has to literally almost just drop everything and walk away. Mm-hmm. I think stories of St. Francis of Assisi is the same type of deal. Like, he's up in front of church and completely disrobes and denounces his family and his wealth and all that to make his pursuit. Like to make these leaps, we almost have to step away or thoroughly question everything. Mm-hmm. You do that a little bit in the last chapter, but, even questioning Plato, and now, as Sid makes his journey and talks to this farmer, as you talk about in this chapter, like, he's asking the farmer to step away what he knows and all these things that the farmer thinks makes him happy, all that other stuff. And then comes to the conclusion that he does.
Yeah, I think that there's a level of, people think that I'm sort of irreverent in some ways. Like, I'll question the words of Jesus and question how useful they are sometimes, or question the words of the Buddha, or question the words of Lao Tzu, or any of these great thinker, Plato and stuff. And like, if I had them in the room, maybe the conversation would go a different way, and maybe the way they spoke about it was useful at the times that they were in too, because everything's in context. But the ability to question, do we cover that in this chapter where I talk about my college class and like the impetus to like really question what's on there and really see if it's valuable? That's what sent me on this journey. Like, if I hadn't been willing to question the status quo about what everybody told me, however much authority they had about what my condition was, then the things that I ended up finding out would if they had happened, they would have happened in a very different way. But, I think I would have ended up resigned to a life of being an addict and, just the feel good smiles inside of a really depressing room once a week or twice a week sometimes, or however often. I mean, I don't know how long I would have lasted. My personality is one that I might have ended my life. I don't know. But the ability to question that, like, I don't hold back. And what's interesting is that may be a Jewish trait. The Jewish Bible, Isaiah, he's like, come, let us reason together. That's the God that wrestled with Jacob. That's the God that was like in physical combat with Jacob. It wasn't like Jacob broke his hip in the process. It wasn't like, wow, God just like spit out a word and my hip broke. It was like they really wrestled. And so like that's the Jewish God. Show up and argue. Show up and meet the text where it's at and question it and ask it and like challenge it. And, Gideon was there, like God tells him to do something. And he's like, I'm not sure that's a possibility. You need to show me that you're on my side. And boom, I want dew on one side of I want dew on the fleece and none on the ground. And then the next day, the opposite. And like, that may be just a Jewish trait. You can thank the Jews for my intrepid questions.
Okay. Well, in that spirit, then,
Yeah.
like, this was definitely a challenging chapter for me, I think, with the Buddhism, like, just as far as, because this is the 84th thing, right?
Yeah, that's in this chapter. Yeah.
So
with the farmer that comes to him and he's like, I have all these problems. And the Buddha's like, I can't help you, but I can help you with the problem that's really causing all the other issues. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like there just isn't a place in this view for sin or redemption or mistakes, or things not being the way that they should be. Would you say that that's true?
I don't know, like, what is a sin to you? So for instance, like, and this is an episode that you guys will hear later, but there's a book that Lee and I just read where we speak of like the internal world, the invisible world. It's literally an invisible world underneath the skin where there are parasites that live on, like, only 10% of your cells are human. And there is an invisible world of colonies of parasites that all have like a hive mind just based on their organism. And those hive minds, when their living environment gets threatened, they hijack motor systems, thoughts, thinking systems, feeling systems, emotional centers, serotonin pathways, like you name it. And they create within the host, a superorganism like a human or an animal, a totally different experience of life. And in that sense, we might say there is a battle being waged and there is some negative influence toward human life. Because if the wages of sin is death and a parasite is that which is trying to decay a human body while it's still alive, then in that sense, there is space to say there is something out there. And I don't know what's powering those parasites any more than I know what's powering this. So on that level, I think it's helpful. Like, I find it useful to speak in terms of like some sort of like there's human cells or human DNA and this other thing. And I can say there is some sort of war being waged in that regard. And that when I'm not on point with my physical care, those things take over. And then I end up doing addictive behaviors and I end up being emotional and whatnot. And if the ancients didn't have a microscope and couldn't see parasites, but they could tell very clearly that some other spirit had taken over a body, then all we have right now is maybe scientific language to talk about the same phenomenon that people have been talking about for millennia. And in that sense, I think we could say there is sin. I don't think, like, for me personally, labeling sin as specific actions or something isn't useful because there's always an exception to those rules. But labeling it as a state, like a person could be in a state of sin, meaning headed toward death as opposed to toward life. If that's the language that's useful for a person, I think there's a place for that. I really do.
Okay.
If you or someone you know is looking to drop the F-bomb of freedom in their life, whether that's from past trauma, depression, anxiety, addiction, or any other host of emotional and personal struggles, but they just don't know how or want some help doing it, head on over to thefreedomspecialist.com/feelbetternow and check out some of the things we've got in store for you, or book a call so we can look at your unique situation and get you the help that you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I just think of like even tragedy or, like child abuse or things like that.
Mhm.
Like, it seems like with that 84th problem, or like, it's like, is the problem really that you think this is a problem? Like, for me, my instinct at least is to say, like, no, like some of these things that happen to people or that I see happen is like, yeah, that is a problem that shouldn't have happened to you. Like,
Well, but that's something that I don't think any of us are equipped to say.
okay,
That a human, as a tiny speck on a dust mite of a planet that's like hurtling around a sun on the edge of some galaxy in a universe that like sneezes out galaxies like it's nobody's business.
I mean, that's not my worldview, but
Well, I mean, just in terms of what we have in terms of scientific, like we are tiny beings on a tiny planet, and that to say that we know what is right or wrong and what should or shouldn't be the case, I don't feel like any human is in a position to make that statement. They might believe that. That's totally cool. But to say that we know is a large leap to me. Like the belief might be there. That said, even in Christian scripture, which is one I'm more familiar with, in the beginning, there's like a tree, there's like a garden. And in that garden is placed a devil or some sort of, depending on who's interpreting the story and who's reading the story, some sort of character that's leading mankind to sin or temptation or whatnot. Who put him there? And to say, so to say that temptation shouldn't exist or that all the wars shouldn't have happened when we're not the ones at the top that's laying the plan and whatnot, I would just like step back and go like, maybe I'm not the judge of the quick and the dead. And maybe me assuming the role of judge instead of abiding by the words that Jesus later said, which is judge not that ye be not judged. Like instead of that, like too many times in my life, I've taken the role of blame. And in that spot, I have suffered because I blame, because all the thoughts that I think course through my body. And then I suffer the judgment that I'm trying to pass on to other people. So in that sense, I think that there is a very real application for this Buddhist view that I think would align with perhaps, maybe not all, I don't know, but some of the things that Jesus is saying, which is, would you just leave the judgment to the actual judge and just assume that everything's happening for your good and do the best you can? How does that land?
I mean, I guess I just think of, like terrible tragedies.
Yeah, but to whom?
To my
Like,
family, you know,
yeah.
to
But that's not a terrible tragedy to the people that want your family dead.
sure.
Right. And so, like, if you look at the history of moral systems, not the history of moral systems that fit the criterion that we make up about moral systems, but the history of like how different societies actually create moral systems, because it's a wonderful question, but like just about like, okay, child sacrifice doesn't happen that often, but it does happen in some society. It has happened in human history in some societies.
Yeah. I mean, some people, well, yeah, I don't know how.
It has been like a major tenet of some societies, not very many, but some. So there are certain human behaviors that it seems like as a collective, they're generally avoided, but they're not universally avoided. So when we say, well, it just feels like that shouldn't be the case, like we're operating from a very limited sense about what is or is not correct. And you look at that and you go, okay, cool. Well, then I'm saying this just feels intuitively wrong, to which point I would say, well, where did that intuition come from? And we want to say it comes from some other higher source, but I can't tell you the number of times that I've had an intuition about something and been wrong about it, as well as the intuitions and been right. And so like, it's a very like suspect thing for me.
But would you say that about something like pedophilia or something like that? That's just a relative.
There was a point where I was like, if there is a God and he doesn't want something to happen, I think he would do something about it, and he wouldn't allow it to. If he really didn't want it to happen, then he wouldn't allow it to happen, which suggests that everything that's happening on the planet right now is fine by him. He may prefer that humans operate a certain way, but maybe he wants humans to have the ability to have those experiences, which means that maybe we're making more out of our experiences than we think they are. But I had to step back and be like, because I had tons of judgments about things like that. I mean, lots of judgments about rich people. I had so many, and that's not even like, you know, that's not even a sin like that. I mean, maybe gluttony, depending on who you're talking to, but like, I had all kinds of judgments and to think back through that situation and go, if there is a God and I really believe that he knows what he's doing, and he's allowing this to happen, then my job is to just do my best. And if I'm going to really mess up and do something he doesn't want me to do, he'll probably stop it. He might stop, he definitely did a flood. He's stopped a few things in the past, according to the records. And so that was a really challenging thing for me to look at, though, to say, like, all the murders that are happening at this very moment, they're good by him, which raises the question of, like, what kind of God do you believe in? Which is why so many people leave religion, but I don't think that that's the answer to that question.
And is that even what we're talking about in this story here? Isn't the Buddha saying to this farmer is that you get to choose what makes you miserable and what makes you doesn't?
Yeah,
is the 84th thing.
Yeah, the 84th problem is that you believe you shouldn't have any of these problems.
So, like the other day, I'm driving along and I blew a tire.
Yeah.
On a fifth wheel trailer that I have, and I sat there and I had this moment of, like, this is a horrible day. And I was like, well, is it a horrible day? Or is it just a blown tire? It's not anything. But I get to make out of it what I want to.
Yeah.
And isn't that what Sid is saying to the farmer?
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially the same thing. And
I'm not saying this tire is evil.
No.
Or good.
But you are saying it's negative toward you, which is a similar kind of judgment.
Or it just happened.
Yeah.
And for me, like, it didn't ruin my day. Mm-hmm. It just happened. Mm-hmm. And I chose to look at it that way.
Yeah.
There's no bigger plan against me. There's no, like, everything work. I mean, I could go there and I could start to list all the things that are against me. And this tire is just another example of something against me. Or it could just be a blown tire.
Yeah. I used to actually think I had committed some sort of moral failure when I didn't get my blood pressure right on the dang blood pressure cuffs in the supermarkets. Because it was just like, I felt like there was some correlation between, if my circumstances don't match a certain ideal, then there's a moral failing in me, which led down a lot of roads. And he's suggesting this from a personal suffering standpoint. I think it's important to note that Buddhism is not a religion, was not created as a religion. He was a Brahmin, so it was within the context of that Brahmin religion and that caste system that he was looking at human suffering only and his own suffering. And he found this sort of middle way, and out of that created practices and brotherhoods and whatnot that still adopted a lot of the religion context that he was in. But his was it's the only religion that doesn't have a cosmology, like this is how the earth started. It's just the fact of the matter is humans are suffering and here's the way out. And so it's sort of like a practical approach to living. And it's become a religion in many ways where people will convert to Buddhism. But in his case, it didn't start that way. Neither did Christianity start necessarily as a separate religion. Jesus was a Jew. And yeah, major challenges to the current hegemony, but still he was a Jew. And so in this case, he's speaking consummately practically, right? That you get to choose, yes. But it was the judgment of something as bad. And sin is, in some ways, very relevant because that is a judgment of something as evil, something to be avoided. But I can say that arsenic is something that will lead to death, and I don't have to have a massive emotional response or aversion to it. I can just be like, well, that's not useful.
Yeah, that insight, I think, has been just really personally helpful to me. And yeah, like thinking of sin as something more like missing the mark or as something more like leading away from life.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's a much more, it's like, okay, cool. So I'm moving away from life. Is it helpful to get really mad about that or to, freak out about that? Or is it helpful to just, keep, change my course or whatever? So that insight, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah. And to use it like a diagnosis in that regard. I mean, if you think about it from even the Garden of Eden story, right? You can eat of any of these trees. This one is sort of poisonous to you, right? Don't eat of this one or you're going to die, basically. And they did. And so, okay, cool. Well, you did that. Now we've got some other things we've got to put in place because, well, now you're in a state that is because you just didn't pay attention to the thing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a big emotional conundrum. It's just like understanding the road signs helps you drive better. If you're in England, you better know that they drive on the other side of the road. There's a great joke that Sadhguru tells about Shankaran Pillai, which is his like made up dude. Shankaran is a first name in one area of India, a common first name, and then like Pillai is a common last name in another area of India. They would never be seen together. So he's got this fake character who's driving down the interstate one day, and he's driving home, and his wife calls him while he's on the way home, and she's like, honey, you just be careful. I know you drive down this freeway. There's some idiot that's driving the wrong way down the freeway. He's like, one idiot? Everyone's driving the wrong way. Anyway, like, to use awareness of a situation as to whether or not it's conducive to your own life is useful. To then, on top of that, layer it with this shouldn't be the case is arguing with life. It already is the case. And so that's, I think, the Buddha's invitation. And that's where I think Plato got it wrong, was to argue with it and to start to add these like extra labels on top of it.
Well, you go on in this chapter to talk about the way that we make ourselves miserable or cause sickness or disease when you talk about the Rorschach Conundrum and the doctor's ability to predict cancer outcomes. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So in keeping with this very same thing, how many people have you heard that are like, oh man, I'm worried sick about this? Or how many children have you watched who are like so upset that they lost their favorite toy that they start exhibiting symptoms of somebody who has a cold? Their nose starts running, they're crying, they have a stomach ache, they start to cough because they can't breathe right. And all the symptoms of a cold show up. Even they start to heat up, right? They start to spike some kind of fever. Like, this thought itself is some sort of viral invader. And so that's what happens inside the body. So in the Krebiosan experience, you have Mr. Wright, that's his last name. And we talk a little bit more about it in the next adventure, but his story is essentially like he has this terminal cancer. He only has a couple weeks to live. There's an experimental drug. He manages to get on. They find the drug is bad, and he's the only one that gets better because he so believed in it that his mind had created a situation to where his body got rid of like grapefruit-sized tumors. And like his chest was leaking fluid. That was all gone within like 10 days. And then he's discharged, completely cancer-free, lives for a while, and then sees a newspaper article that says, oh, all the tests failed. And then all of a sudden, within like a short amount of time, he's back in the hospital with the same cancers, the same tumor, everything else. So the doctor does some quack medicine, injects him with sterile water, makes him believe he's got an even more potent dose. And again, same thing happens. All the tumors go away. Everything's fine until there was a final news article that said, sorry, this is actually it. This drug doesn't work at all. It's a horrible drug. And then he came in and he died like within a week later or some short amount of time later. And that's just there's numerous studies, thousands upon thousands of studies, and like the Institute of Noetic Sciences and a lot of these others that are linking mental actions to biological states. And when those mental actions are sustained, then the biological state becomes a muscle memory or a tissue memory or something like that. And then that can create illness. That goes both ways, though, and we talk about that in the next chapter, but it really is a fascinating like approach. So when we're dealing with emotional problems, mental issues bring that up. I went physical here just so that we could really pin down that this is a biological phenomenon, not just like some woo-woo positive thinking kind of Tony Robbins coach, like, no, your thoughts create your reality and whatnot, which I do think dovetails into the question about what faith might be, which if you consider it just from the standpoint of focus, unwavering focus upon an object, then as if that's where your faith is in that you have cancer, your faith is in that you have depression, your faith is in that Satan is after you instead of faith in Christ or something like that. Where you put your focus is where your body creates a reality. And so it does dovetail both into the religious question. And I don't think that's a challenge to dump the religion, but I actually think that there's some really beautiful, intelligent, wise things that whoever pieced these together has created as like pointers to the very biological phenomena that are going on to resolve a lot of people's spiritual woes, emotional, and then also physical ones as well. And that's all inside of this chapter. And then the Rorschach Conundrum is just Mr. Wright's story came about because he was one of several patients who had been tested for Rorschach. and had a personality test done in that way. And it was based on his personality that he was pegged as somebody who would have, like, he was singled out as somebody who was difficult to predict whether their cancer would go quickly or not, just based on the personality. And so, and then we talk about that with Quincy's story in this chapter too, and how it was like the people who are too busy trying to like put on a good face in the world and do all the right things, that those are the people that tend to have the faster growing cancers, of which, you know, he went back and forth pretty quickly. So, moral of the story, right? You either are really good with who you are and you love everything about yourself and you're not judging yourself as bad and worthless and disappointing and unworthy. You just love the being that you are and you assume that God did a great job on you, or the creator or whatever it is. Or you're on the back end of it and you're totally neurotic and you know that you're messed up, but you don't give a rip. Those people tend to have the slow growing cancers, the sociopaths. And everybody else in the middle, the neurotic ones that are trying to keep up appearances, those tend to be the people that suffer the most from illnesses. And it was also seen in tuberculosis patients as well, that was the case. So finishing up our discussion on this chapter, essentially, like what we're looking at is that the way that you think does influence your cells. And I think we will talk about more about that in the next chapter. It does influence how your body acts. And so it's not something to be discounted. But I will say that it is easier to retrain your thoughts when you're using the body differently and engaging with the body than trying to do it by thought alone, which is where the entire psychology has been for a long time. The industry has been, to the point where right now they are actually starting to abandon that. And they're starting to move toward these sort of sacred sacraments of various old traditions and tribal, you know, like psilocybin and iboga and ayahuasca and ergotized beer that the Greeks used to use, and all of these different sacraments in order to create somatic states and conscious states, altered states of consciousness to start to change people's psychological suffering, because there's a realization that just the mind alone, just thinking through the problem, isn't getting us anywhere. And I think that's the end of the experiment that Plato started, which is, no, reason alone will do it. Reason is one state of consciousness that's very useful, but there are a great many more states of consciousness, and those tend to be the ones that people suffer in.
And that's it for today's Alive and Free podcast. If you enjoyed this show and want some more freedom bombs landing in your earbuds, subscribe right now at wherever you get your podcasts from. And while you're at it, give us a rating and a review. It'll help us keep delivering great stuff to you. Plus, it's just nice to be nice.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.